Okay, hi everybody, good morning. Welcome to Durham for those of you who are visiting for the first time. My name is Nicole Westmarland. I'm a Professor of Criminology at Durham University, and I'm going to be opening the day and chairing some of the morning. So this is the schedule. I think there are some on the tables for you, or if anybody wants to get slightly more technical, you can scan the, whatever it's called, the barcode. But you can see that the morning, I'm not going to go over it because you've got it in front of you. We've got a good combination of different people speaking, of academic and policing content, and we hope that you're going to feel really enthusiastic by the end of the day. Oh, even at the beginning of the day would be fine as well. Let's not wait to be enthusiastic. We've got two book publishers to share with you today. The first one is Palgrave Macmillan. They have a table outside and they have a member of staff here, and they are making policing and violence against women books available with a 20% discount today. Also, Bristol University Press aren't able to be here today, but they are offering a 20% discount with this discount code until the end of June, and also a very special offer of 50% discount on Fiona Vera Gray's book, which you're going to hear about today. And I think Fiona also has some copies available today to sell as well, if anybody wants a special signed copy. I tend to not sign them if I give them to my students because I think it devalues the book if they want to give it to somebody else. But that will not be the case with Fiona's. I'm also going to just tell you we have the hashtag N8 violence against women and girls. If you are tweeting today, then please use that hashtag. Do tag the N8 PRP in if you can. You should also have a piece of paper on your table which is some notes, and we're going to ask you to write some ideas and actions by the end of the day. Take that home with you and use it when I am told the evaluation will be 2 minutes maximum. If you're anything like me, then I would have lost that piece of paper by the time I came to do the evaluation. So I think I'll probably take a photograph of any ideas that I get so that I can feed them into that evaluation. So what is the N8 PRP, since that is the hashtag? Well, it was established in 2013, and it is a research and knowledge exchange partnership with the N8 universities in the north of England and the 12 police forces. It is co-directed by Ngaire and Jeff, if they want to give people a wave, if people don't know them. And you'll be hearing more from Ngaire this afternoon as well. And this is the 7th time that we've come together in what we call a policing innovation forum. So getting lots of new ideas, up and coming ideas together in one room with academics and police to try to find solutions to kind of some of the pressing policing problems of today. I've got to tell you a few housekeeping things. First of all, parking. If you haven't put your number plate in one of the iPads, you are very likely to get a parking ticket, and you should leave now and do that because that is more important even than hearing Fiona speak. So you can just pretend like you've forgotten something and nip out. The fire meeting point is the top car park. There is actually a fire alarm planned, a test, at 12:30 today. So I think probably one of the people who is presenting at the behind the scenes of anti-harassment campaigns will be the lucky winner who gets the fire alarm to go off while they're speaking. Okay, what else did I want to say? I just wanted to set the scene a little bit. 16 years ago, when I first joined Durham University, certainly violence against women, even domestic violence, was seen as a niche topic, certainly not something which would have filled a room like this, and certainly not actually that most universities or police forces would have invested the money to fill a room like this in. It was seen as a niche topic on the outskirts of criminology. It was seen as a women's issue and as a women's problem. Now, of course, we are realising that just the huge scale, and it's doubtful that any women in this room actually have not experienced some form of violence or harassment in public space. Some more than others. We know that things like age, disability, ethnicity, and more intersects. Not all women are equally impacted, and some carry a heavier burden than others. And we also now know that it's a problem that everybody needs to work together on. So it's no longer a problem of a few feminists to solve, or some activists, or some specialist rape crisis centres, or refuges. It's something that we all have to work together on, and that is police, academics, activists, specialist organisations, but it's also women and men to come together to solve the problem. We hear a lot about high-profile, devastating cases in the news. Sabina Nessa, Sarah Everard, herself a Durham University student a few years ago. But today is about those, but it's also about the certainly less serious, but culminatingly still damaging instances. Violence against women in public space is there all the time. It's normal for many to experience. It's a mundane part of day-to-day and night-to-night life for many. In bars, on public transport, while out running, at work, at the gym, the list is unfortunately endless. Those of you who know me think, how's she going to turn this around? Because she's normally optimistic and uplifting. Where's she going to go from here? Well, the uplifting part is that we can definitely stop this. You know, there's nothing innate or inbuilt or deterministic about misogynistic attitudes towards women. And we're going to be hearing today about lots of efforts that have already been put in place to change these attitudes and behaviours. One woman who has been on a mission to create change in this area is Dr Fiona Vera Gray. I asked her how many copies of her book have sold so far, because I know it has sold a lot of copies, and she said she didn't know. So I'm going to go with countless copies, unquantifiable number of books that have been sold, which actually all started with an article that she wrote, how many years ago would you have written the conversation article? In 2017, which went viral. It got 150,000 views, which, trust me, for an academic is a lot. She then went on to write her book. She became special advisor to the Women and Equalities Committee, where she was an advisor on sexual violence in public spaces. And she's currently working as a reader in Child and Women Abuse Studies Unit at London Metropolitan University, after we lost her from Durham. But there's no hard feelings, and please join me in welcoming Fiona Vera Gray.
So weird to be back in an actual room with people. It's really nice, but I feel quite nervous because I haven't done this now in many years. Okay. All right, so thank you, Nicole. That was a lovely introduction. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm really pleased to be here. It's really great to actually be able to be back in a room with lots of different people. I think what we've been missing over the last couple of years is some of the conversations that we get to have at break times, at coffee times, at lunch times. That's where some of the real work happens. I'm really looking forward to having some of those today. Like Nicole, I want to start with something hopeful, and I think that that's the fact that the topic of today's forum, violence against women and girls in public spaces, that in itself really means something to me. We can't underestimate how important it is that that's the topic of today's forum, and how unexpected that would have been just a few years ago. When I started researching women's experiences of sexual intrusion in public space in 2012, there was little, if any, interest in thinking about this as a real form of violence against women. It was seen as trivial, it was dismissed, normalised, not seen as serious or harmful, definitely not as harmful or serious as rape or domestic violence, domestic abuse, despite the fact that sexual harassment is overwhelmingly the most common form of violence against women and girls. Policing colleagues were rarely interested in it, as thinking about it as a form of violence against women and girls, because it wasn't something that women were reporting. So it wasn't seen as being particularly serious or particularly harmful because women weren't coming forward to the police about it. And I think some of the reasons for that might be addressed in Bianca's keynote later. And academics were really busy, as Nicole said, building what was at that time quite a limited evidence base around other forms of sexual violence, including sexual harassment, but not so much focused on public space. So very much thinking about sexual harassment in workplace contexts, and then after that in educational contexts. So I've been really lucky in the 10 years that I've been looking at this area, I've actually seen a huge amount of change in the area that I work in, which many of us don't get to see. It started in the UK really with, I think, Everyday Sexism, set up by Laura Bates in 2014. And then that was really amplified by Me Too in 2017. Women have really used social media to combat some of the normalisation of this. That's actually something that an academic article that Bianca's written on that. It became harder and harder to ignore what so many women and girls were experiencing in their day-to-day. It's still trivialised today, so we're not out the other end yet, but not to the same extent. So we've had public-facing campaigns from bodies like the Home Office, which we're going to hear about today. We've had local campaigns really recently from PCCs, including Manchester and London, both of which have really focused on the everyday forms of sexual harassment that women and girls experience. We've had the Selected Committee inquiry into public sexual harassment. We've got this forum. So all of these are things that I really wouldn't have dreamed possible when I first started thinking about my PhD. But I also want to acknowledge, as Nicole mentioned in her introduction, that part of the reason that we're focusing on this area today and the reason why it's so hard now to dismiss women's experiences of intrusive male strangers is that in the past 2 years, there have been at least 4 extremely high-profile public space killings of women in the UK. Their murders took place mostly in London, but what was done to them resonated with women everywhere. And these are the women. So Sabina Nessa, Sarah Everard, Ashleen Murphy, Biba Henry, and Nicole Smallman. It's important as we start today to acknowledge that they are part of the reason that we are here, and they're part of the reason that we're seeing change, as well as to recognise them as being much more than what was done to them. To honour these 5 women as individual women with whole and full lives that were ahead of them. Because that's not how the men who killed them saw them. Those 4 men saw them as nameless, faceless, dehumanised women. Any woman. All women. I want to recognise that for Sabina, Sarah, Ashleen, Biba and Nicole, this was not the first time that they had experienced men's violence and harassment in public. They, like most women in this room, would have experienced routine forms of sexual harassment in public since childhood. For Sabina, Biba and Nicole, this would have been racialised as well. And they, like many women in this room, would have felt scared on some kind of background level that they could one day be that nameless, faceless, dehumanised victim. But then they would have dismissed it because we're told that that's rare. It's not going to happen to you. Growing up, they would have been flashed at, stared at, whistled at, catcalled. They, like many of us, would have had experiences that they couldn't quite pin down. Not sure if he's following me or if he's just going the same way. I'm not sure if he's a dangerous one or just a run-of-the-mill intrusive one. They, like us, would have had that internal voice saying, you're probably being paranoid, hysterical, that kind of thing is rare, it's rare as long as you do the right things. Stick to the main road, stay with friends, call your boyfriends, stick to the path, run in the afternoon, not the night time. And they did those things, as we all do most days, some days, small daily decisions, changes to what we want to do and where we want to be, where we want to go, what we want to wear. And they still weren't safe. Not because of what they did, but because in the UK today, women aren't safe in public and in private. And I want us to acknowledge that. So this kind of daily decision-making that I've been talking about based on the possibility of violence against women and girls in public is called safety work. It's a development of a sociologist called Ali Hochschild's work on emotional labour. It's something that comes from Professor Liz Kelly, who's the director at the Research Institute where I work. She talks about safety work as being the work that women do to prevent violence, and violence work being the work that women have to do to reclaim a sense of self in the aftermath of violence. When we think about safety work, we need to be thinking about the ways in which women's fear in public space is taken for granted on one level, and that fear is seen as being irrational. Not men's lack of awareness, which I'll talk about in a minute when I talk about fear of crime. And it's really important as well to acknowledge that I'm not saying that men don't do this work, but it's not expected in the same way, and I'm going to talk about what I mean about that in a minute. What's expected of women is to reduce ourselves, to be less visible, to be less vocal, to take up less space in public in order to be safer. It's something I've been talking about since 2014, when it really started coming up in my PhD. I know we've got some people here, women here, doing their PhDs, and it's such an exciting thing to do, because sometimes what happens is not what you expect, and this is absolutely something that came up that I didn't expect. So as part of my research, I asked women to keep a notebook recording how many times in public they experienced intrusion or harassment from a male stranger. As a method, it was designed to capture those kind of experiences that we don't remember because they're not that big. So you might remember the big ones, where something particularly scary happens, but you forget all the daily little minutiae of intrusion that you might experience. So this was, I thought, going to pick up that. But when the notebooks came back, what I found was that it wasn't happening as much as women felt it was. So when we'd first had an interview, women had talked about the fact that this happens daily, every day. When they walk outside, this is happening all of the time. But when they were actively looking to write things down, it wasn't happening as much as they thought it was. But what was happening much, much more than they thought, or that they said in that initial interview, was that they were adapting their day-to-day movements, decisions, choices in order to prevent sexual violence in public. So from really small things like thinking about what they would wear or where they would go, where they'd sit on a bus or a train, how they'd stand on a platform, through to women who wouldn't use public transport at all, or who wouldn't leave the house alone at night, which may sound extreme, but is something that many, many women do. And when all this came back, myself and my participants were really shocked because we hadn't realised the extent of their adaptations, and neither had I, because no one had really asked us to think about it. It was a form of invisible work. It had been habitualised. No one had ever talked about it as well, but in the way that things changed, 6 years later, everyone did, and women started to talk about it a lot. So in 2020, in the days that followed the disappearance of Seva Everard, before the public were told that she had been abducted and raped and murdered by a male-serving Met officer, there was an outpouring of anger from women on social media following the fact that the Met had told women in Clapham to stay indoors. You'll remember this was March 2020, when we were all in heavy lockdown, only allowed out for exercise once or twice a day. The fact that women were being singled out in this already very restricted space to restrict our space even further was too much, and women pushed back, finally talking about the range and extent of the safety work that we do daily. So what do you think the response was to this? Was it outrage on behalf of the fact that so many women are living these kind of half lives? Was it solidarity from other women who maybe didn't feel as constrained but still recognised that fear as coming from a real place, a valid place, because women are unsafe? Nope. Sadly, no. Women were told, like our own internal voice has been trained to tell us, that we were wrong, that we were paranoid, hysterical, that it's rare, the kind of thing that happened to Sarah and to Bieber and Nicole before her and to Sabina and Aisling after, that it's rare as long as you do the right things, stick to the main road, stay with friends, call your boyfriend. This response to women expressing our wholly reasonable fears, that these fears are somehow irrational, is something we're quite used to. It's a big part of the reason why we have that internal voice that talks us down and why women don't speak about the work that they're doing to keep themselves safe. It's also connected to what a lot of us in this room will know as the fear of crime paradox, which is the finding that across decades, Research kind of consistently finds that men are more likely to be a victim of crime in public, but women are more likely to be scared of it. It's important to note here that the paradox again reaffirms that idea that women can't or don't have an estimation of their own level of risk. Again, that idea that women's fear is irrational. And we don't think about, actually what we need to explain is why are men so bad at estimating their level of risk? But there's numerous reasons that are given for why women get this level of risk wrong in the literature. And it can be summarised broadly into these kind of three groups. The first one talks about gender roles and representation, and so it talks about here the fact that women are more likely to be able to accept our vulnerability, whereas men, there's lots of social barriers to men being able to accept that they might be vulnerable. The second one is the shadow of sexual assault thesis, which is that when women talk about being scared of crime in public space, it's a very particular crime that we're scared of, and that crime is rape, and that overshadows our fear of other forms of crime in public. And this third one from Betsy Stanko is about what counts as criminal. So the idea that when we talk about women being more afraid than they are likely to be a victim of crime, what we're counting in terms of that victim of crime barrel excludes a whole lot of forms of violence and harassment that aren't counted in traditional crime statistics because women don't report it or because it's not actually something that's criminal. So if we take the first two together and think about why are women more likely to acknowledge our vulnerability to crime? Why are we more scared of being a victim? What messages are women given around this? And then we start to look into culture, right? And so we see that violence against women and girls, particularly that perpetrated by a male stranger, is the foundation, really, of the true crime genre. Something that's particularly taken off on platforms like Netflix, a range of podcasts about it now. It's also a regular feature in TV series and fictional films. What we're told here, particularly in relation to rape and murder by a male stranger of a woman, is that though it might not be everywhere, it is anywhere. Though it might not happen to every woman, it could happen to any woman. That we're at risk simply for being a woman. It's not just true crime documentaries and violence against women and girls as entertainment, it's also the statistics that we get, the messages that we get when we hear about other women's experiences of violence against women and girls in public. So the man who killed Sabina Nessa, for example, drove 1.5 hours from Eastbourne into London to find a woman to kill, any woman, whoever he came across, because he thought he'd be less likely to be caught in London, easier to be anonymous. The man who killed Bieber Henry and Nicole Smallman had made a pact with Satan to kill 6 women every 6 months. Any women, 6 women. The male police officer who killed Sarah Everard was on the streets looking for a woman to abduct, to rape and to kill. Any woman. The man who murdered Aisling when she was out for an afternoon run was waiting for a woman to come past. Again, any woman. And I'd like the men here to think about that, about what it must be like as a woman to know that there are men driving around looking for you, not every man, but any man, sitting in parks waiting for you to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And I want you to put to one side the voice that tells you that me saying these things is hysterical, that it's paranoid, that I'm fear-mongering. I want you to think about being surrounded by entertainment which is based on true and fictional representations of the men who do this to women, where the men are humanised and given full and rich inner lives, and the women that they kill are nothing. They're just a vehicle for the crime, and it's the crime that's important, it's the crime that needs to be solved. Violence against women and girls in public has become an invisible background. It's so close we don't even see it anymore, but I want us to see it, to recognise it. Because when we do that, it makes it much more difficult to tell women or to think about women's fear as being an irrational response. This was part of the memorial left at for Sarah Everard. And, this idea that it could have been any of us, to truly take that on board is terrifying. And that is something that women are navigating daily. But the second piece of this crime paradox puzzle, which Nicole alluded to in her introduction, is this idea of what counts as criminal. So sure, maybe women don't experience as much crime in public space, But that might be because a lot of what we're experiencing that makes us feel unsafe either isn't counted in crime statistics or isn't criminal at all. So an example that I always use for this is women being told to cheer up, love, smile. It's always one of my favourite examples because no one wants to make that criminal, right? There's no feminists out there campaigning to criminalise men telling women to cheer up. And yet when I talk to women about it, routinely women say, oh, that's one of the worst ones. I really hate that. Really don't like it. It can't be considered a form of hate crime. This is not motivated by hate. And it's hard to even work out why it should be seen as a form of violence against women. But it is uniquely gendered. It is only men saying this to women. And it has a particularly powerful underlying message, which is why women talk about it being one of the worst ones. Because what it's saying to that woman is you could have nothing going on internally that is important. You don't have a rich inner world. You're not really a person. There's nothing about you or your life that you might need to be thinking about that is more important than how you look for me walking down the street. It's such an interruption of the rare times that women are in their selves. And when we think about being in public, for women, a lot of times that's some of the only time that women are able to think because you're not at work, you're not with your kids, you're not in your homes, you're going to and from. And sometimes that's the rare opportunities that women have to actually be considering things, to think things, to mull things over. And that's interrupted. You being a person is wiped out and instead you are just a woman, any woman. And as a woman, you know what that kind of thinking where it can lead. So it's the same kind of message that we get from catcalls and wolf whistles and all those forms of sexual harassment in public that are commonly dismissed as trivial, as being part of kind of just heterosexual courtship. Take it as a compliment. And it's why those forms of violence aren't harmless. They're foundational to how girls become women, and how we learn that we are not people on the same footing as men. And it's a constant reminder that we can be seen at any point as any woman. So I'm not going to give you statistics here about how many women experience sexual harassment in public, in their life, because I've been researching this now for 10 years, and I think it's incredibly hard to measure because women forget, because so much of this is background. But I am going to say that almost every woman in this room would have at least one, sometimes many, particular moments that they remember from childhood that they could tell you as an anecdote from childhood or adolescence where something happened. Being flashed out on the way to school, grown men whistling at them when they're teenagers and they're not quite sure what that means. And I'd also hazard a guess that most of us can remember a close shave, one of those nothing really happened moments where something was happening that was really hard to decipher, but we acted to prevent it in some way. These incidents mapped across a woman's life sit on a continuum of sexual intrusion, and this concept of a continuum was introduced by Liz Kelly in 1988, and it's come to be used a lot in how we think about violence against women and girls. But I see it increasingly being misrepresented, misunderstood, as meaning a spectrum. So where there's bad, being catcalled is bad, to worse, rape, rather than actually what it means, which is that these things shade in and out of each other, that the messages that women get when they're catcalled are reminiscent of the messages that they get when and if they're raped. So when I want you to think about what a continuum means, it means a continuum across experiences. They feel connected, they feel similar. Women talking about being told to cheer up has that dehumanization aspect of it that feels similar to other forms of violence against women and girls. There's also continuums within experiences. So most women who are raped in public space are followed prior to that interaction. For a lot of them, there is some kind of verbal interaction before that interaction, a hello, an excuse me, a calling after somebody. Those things shade into each other. And there's also a continuum in impacts and meanings. It's not linear. And we need to really get away from this idea that violence happens to you and then you overcome it and you're a survivor of violence. To actually think about, particularly with public sexual harassment and public forms of violence against women, it can be constant reminders and it can be moving backwards and forwards through your process for the rest of your life. It's also important why we need to gender the phenomenon we're talking about. So it's not that men and boys don't face violence and harassment in public, or that non-binary and gender non-conforming people aren't particularly targeted for forms of violence and harassment by those who feel really threatened by the challenge that they pose to their worldview. And nor am I making an argument for a universal category of women, which takes my experience as a white woman and uses it to flatten all of our differences. But I do think we need to acknowledge that women as a group are uniquely addressed in relationship to being the cause and the solution to violence against women and girls in public. And we can really see this when we look at traditional forms of safety advice. So this is a selection of police anti-rape campaigns from the last few years. What's the cause here of violence against women and girls in public? It's women walking alone, it's women drinking too much, it's women not watching their drinks constantly, it's women going home without taking all of their friends with them. And what's the solution then, if that's the cause? It's women changing their behaviour. This one's even more explicit. So again, this is the idea that women drinking is the cause of rape, but even more than that, look at the acronym, be smart. Be smart. So the underlying message there is that women are raped because we're not very smart. If we were a bit smarter, we would stop all this rape from happening to us. And it might sound like I'm being kind of flippant here, but it's not. This is something that Betsy Stanko raised in the 90s, that if traditional safety advice is framed as common sense, which often it is, then the underlying message there is that women lack common sense, that we're stupid. And that's why we keep getting raped and killed and followed and violated. But it's not just from police that we get these messages. So everyone gets in on the act. We've got here some from a liquor licensing board in America. These really infamous ones from Transport for London. They took down these the Cabwise ads after a lot of complaining. It took them a while to take them down. But then they launched this equally kind of ill-advised home safe selfie campaign where they encouraged women to take a day-to-day safety work practice, which is texting your friends when you get home safe, and to make it a campaign to advertise the fact that that night you didn't get raped and killed. And we also get it really directly, not from campaigns, but from what women are told in the incredibly rare, of course, times when a woman is raped or sexually assaulted or killed in public. So what we're getting here is an onslaught of messages, contradictory messages, telling us on one hand that sexual violence is pretty much inevitable, that it's incredibly common for women. And this is a message that we know to be true through our own experience because, like the continuum, we have all had experiences that sit somewhere in that, along that continuum. So we're told on one hand that sexual violence is pretty much inevitable and that we need to do a number of things. So not go out alone, not drink, not wear headphones, wave down a bus, check our drink, be smarter if we want it to prevent it. So really common, you need to do these things to prevent it. So then we go, okay, cool, we're going to do lots of things to try and prevent it. And we start talking about all of the things that we do to try and prevent it. We're told we're hysterical. We're told we're paranoid. We're told we're fear-mongering. What are you talking about? It's incredibly rare that this happens. There's no need to change your behaviour. So you see the contradictions, right? Taken together, what's happening here is that women are being tasked with something that one of my participants in my PhD called the right amount of panic. You need to find the right amount of panic. Panic too much and you're being paranoid. Don't panic enough and you're to blame. The thing is that this is a catch-22 because women can only ever get it wrong. We can never know when we get it right. You can never know when your decision to not go out that night, to not take that shortcut, to take a different route, to not look up, to ignore the guy who's calling you behind. You can never know if that's successful and successfully intervenes and disrupts something that was going to happen because success is the absence of a predicted outcome. nothing happens. And then we are told that nothing happens because nothing was going to happen anyway. You're hysterical, you're paranoid. So we can only ever count the times when we get it wrong. And then we're made responsible for not doing that time, whatever it is that someone thinks would have, could have made a difference. And that's the harm of traditional safety advice. It feeds into this impossible position. At the same time as telling women that they need to be changing their behaviour to prevent violence, it erases the fact that women are daily changing their behaviour to prevent violence. And violence still happens. Because ultimately, even though we can be and we might be much more successful at preventing violence against women and girls in public than we are ever given credit for, we cannot prevent it all. Because no matter what we might do, we might run into one of those men who is driving around or sitting and waiting in public space for a woman, any woman. And so this is where I want us to end. We need to start somewhere different when we think about the work that women do to stay safe. We need to start from a place of recognition that women are already doing this work, that we are routinely, accurately assessing risk and responding to it, that we are highly skilled at this because we've been practicing it often since we were children, and that we are routinely successful, that we're capable, but that it's not enough. I get asked a lot these days by parents of daughters about what they should do. You know, they listen to me talk about these things and then they say, oh God, I've got a teenage girl and I want to tell her all of these things and you've just told me I can't tell her all of these things because that's going to be bad for her. So what do I tell her? Because I want to keep her safe. Or, you know, something's just happened to my girl and I want to tell her something. So to stop that from happening again, what do I do? And this is kind of what I say now about what we should think about when we have this urge to give safety advice to the women and girls that we know and love, and also to just more broadly to women and girls in society. And it's not as satisfying as that myth of don't do this and you'll be fine, but it's much more realistic and ultimately it's much more useful. So firstly, we need to stop that idea of positioning women as being paranoid or hysterical or fear-mongering. Let's just let that go. We need to stop telling women to change their behaviour. They're already changing their behaviour. It's not working. We need to start looking elsewhere then, looking for men or bystanders to change their behaviour, and this is something that's going to be covered in the next panel. I think some really great campaigns that are doing just this. But that's not enough. We also need to think about how we can do that last step, that missing step, which is around validating the work that women are doing and recognising why they are doing it. We need to give messages to women and girls to combat that voice we've internalised that tells us we're overreacting. And we need to acknowledge that women and girls feeling unsafe isn't the problem. Women and girls being unsafe is. That's the thing that we need to change, not women's behaviour. Thank you.
Q&A. Right, we do have some time for questions, much as Fiona wants to avoid answering them. We've got two mics, so if I could ask you to wait until the microphone gets to you, even if you think you've got a loud voice, there may be people in the audience who need to, for that sound to go through the microphone, please. And if I can just ask, when asking your question, if you can just say your name and where you're from would be brilliant. So we have one question here, I think.
Hello, I'm Emily from Cleveland Police, and we're sort of running a VAWG agenda at the minute. Do you have any examples of positive campaigns that have been run that we could, well, I'll call borrow with pride, but effectively just put a Cleveland Police flag on it?
I think so. The panel that you're chairing afterwards is going to give some examples of some really good campaigns that are focused on men changing their behaviour. Campaigns that are around that last piece of the puzzle, which is doing something to acknowledge what women are navigating and have been navigating since they're really little, don't exist. And so it's a new piece of work that needs to be done. Just something quite simple that is showing and recognising the fact that women experience this from girlhood right the way through. I think that that could be incredibly powerful, because that would help validate for women something that we are told to ignore. And also for men, I think it would demonstrate some of the harms, and it would help shift that idea that this isn't harmful, that it isn't serious. Because I think when you see it across, when you see how much women have navigated, it's quite hard to then go, oh, just take it like a compliment. It's not that bad. You actually start to see, oh, hang on, this is something that we do need to change. So that piece of the puzzle I haven't seen in a campaign, but there's some really good campaigns coming out now around men changing their behaviour, and that's something we're going to talk about in the next panel.
And if you call it knowledge exchange, then you don't have to call it stealing.
Oh, is that what you call it?
Gitanjali? If you can
No
use
one's got
it
loud
in
enough
case
voice.
people can use it. Yeah.
Okay, I'm not as loud as I think, clearly. Thank you for that. It's a brilliant presentation. I just have a question about the campaigns as well, which is, how do you think campaigns against violence against women and girls can actually reflect the intersectional experiences that a lot of women and girls have? So obviously examples are around racism. So a lot of the time when women of color experience intrusion, that can be classified or understood as race related, whereas it could be both race related. So say, for instance, a woman of color is asked to go back to her country by a man, and it's almost always a man. Is that sexual harassment, or is it racism? And where does that intersect, and how does it help women to, how do women understand that experience, and how can that be better reflected in campaigns? I know that's a huge question, but I'm sure you have the answer.
So much faith in me, Gitanjali. I don't have the answer, but I think it's really important. And I think it's an important thing to think about, that it's not enough to just have some black and brown women experiencing sexual harassment in your campaign on sexual harassment, that you need to go much further than that. So IMCAN did, as part of the Mayor's campaign in 2016, and I'm sure you would have seen it, they did a specific video which is about the experience of black and minoritized young women in London with sexual harassment. If any of you haven't seen it, you can Google it on YouTube. It's called I Just Want to Be Free, from IMCAN, IMKAAN. And I think that they did a really good job of it, but the video is like 3 or 4 minutes long. And the challenge in these short campaigns is that you get 30 seconds, 20 seconds, and how do you get across these really complex messages? Because I think some of the difficulty, which I definitely saw as part of the helping the Home Office with their recent campaign, and went through to a couple of consultation sessions around that with Professor Perna Sen, who brought up a lot of this, that actually what you don't want to then do is have some kind of brown woman experiencing sexual harassment and have it being seen as being, well, that's something that happens to those women over there. Or have this idea of a white saviour complex, that somehow we need to come in and rescue these women that are experiencing it, not me, white woman. So it's very difficult, it's a very complex area, and I think that when police are doing campaigns like this, but also when other organisations are doing campaigns, it's really important to work with the specialist black and minoritised women and girls sector, to talk to them about these issues and to try and get an understanding from them about what would change, and to really have in mind that it's not just enough, representation isn't enough. You need to do something particular to show how racialised sexual harassment changes what we think of as racist harassment and changes what we think of as sexual harassment. So it's not really an answer, but the answer is work with your specialist black and minoritised women's organisations.
And provide the funding for that.
Provide the funding.
Okay, we've probably got time for one more, Ngaire.
Yeah, Ngaire Waine. I'm a police officer in Merseyside. I've been going into some girls' schools and sixth form centres recently. And I just think young girls and young women suffer from street harassment. By the time you get to my age, you become a bit more invisible. Mm-hmm. And I just wonder if there is any sort of more work that's being done, particularly for teenagers, young 21-year-olds, that is specific and can help and recognise their experiences, because I think their experiences are different. As you get older, it's actually possibly you're not as interesting to.
So one of the things that I thought a lot about that in my PhD, because I had older women and younger women, and just a slight reframe of that idea of being invisible, because I think you do become invisible as you age, but also you become more highly skilled at preventing and disrupting. So when you're younger, it's kind of your first real experiences, and men know that. Men who are going to do that know that. So they know that if they sit next to a 14-year-old girl on the bus and start making or doing something to them, the girl is going to sit there because she's been told to be quiet and demure and polite. If someone does that to a 40-year-old woman, to a 50-year-old woman, we've had enough experiences that now we're going to either get up and leave, or if we feel safe enough, respond to that man. So I think that we're told that it's because we're invisible, because we're told to think about this as being heterosexual courtship and you've aged out of the beauty standard. But I don't think that that's all or even mostly what's happening. I think that you've gotten really, really good at changing your behaviour, so you're actually in the spaces less that it happens. And I think that men target younger women because of that. So that's the first thing I'd say. In terms of work, again, specialist violence against women and girls organisations are doing a lot of this work with girls. And it's one of the reasons why I think that this idea about a campaign or talking to girls, validating their reality, coming from a point of saying this is what happens to you, not you're paranoid, you're hysterical, it's very rare. I think that that will do a lot, because that will open up the space for girls to be able to talk about it. Girls these days have access to social media, which I didn't have growing up, and that's doing some of that validation work. But they're also still taking in all of these broader social messages that are telling them to dismiss it, trivialise it, not think about it, experience it as a compliment. So I think it's about going in with a really open agenda to create a space for girls to talk about it, and then a space for them to think about how they want things to be different. So kind of throwing it over to them is what I do. But there's some like rape crisis centres, specialist Black and minoritized organisations that are doing really good work with girls in schools. So fund, again, lobby the government to fund specialist organisations to do this work, not expect teachers to be able to be experts in this and do it, and not expect other organisations to do it. Actually go to the support services and fund them to do the work themselves.
We probably have got time for one more actually, and then we will stop for coffee. One at the back here.
Hi, my name is Nora. I'm a PhD student at the University of Leeds. And thank you very much, Fiona. I think you put into words things that I knew but didn't really know how to say. And my question is about those campaigns targeting men, because I could imagine that the campaigns targeting women might be a little bit more successful. I mean, a right campaign is great, but a successful campaign is something different. It's ingrained to us how to behave from childhood, but how can a campaign that a man sees on the bus stop and probably just looks through it be successful? Like, how do we reach adult men or teenage boys that are already past the stage where parents have a really strong influence, and socialization and peer behavior is just way more important in shaping behavior?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think that what we know about prevention is that one-off campaigns to anybody make no difference. It doesn't do anything. And when you think about all of the messages, I mean, this was on the messages that women and girls get about violence against women and girls. There's a whole nother presentation, maybe another forum, that's on the messages that men and boys get about what it needs to be a man, and how a lot of the time you need to demonstrate your heterosexuality, and you do that through acting on other women. So you're doing it not really because of the woman, because she's nothing, you're doing it to prove your masculinity to yourself and to other men. And so to change that, I do agree. I think one-off campaigns or campaigns have a place, But what we need is like a multi-channel, long-term investment in change that's going to take, and this is the thing that's really difficult for government, it's going to take, it's long, it's going to take 25 years, but that's what we need to do. I want to think that when I'm 60, this work has been done, and so we're not having this conversation because the boys that are being born now would have grown up in those 20 years and had from everywhere, like funding for entertainment to give you different messages, seeing ads on buses, education in schools, different messages from their parents, that it's a whole community, a whole society that needs to be invested in change. That feels really optimistic, but I think that there's a momentum now and there's a pressure now. There's enough people that want some change that we could actually do it. I heard from, so Liz the other day said something really sad, actually. She said that she used to say that we could end violence against women and girls in our lifetime, and she's saying now it's not. But then she was saying it's because she's 70. So she was like, I don't have much of my lifetime left, but I don't think it's going to happen in my lifetime. But I want us to think like we actually could. We actually could. It wouldn't change it for us in the room, but it would change it for the next generation. And that's only going to happen if we all really actually push it forward. And I think that campaigns are part of that, but they're not the whole answer. There's not a whole answer. There's not a silver bullet, but we just need to start doing everything that we can in all different places that we can to try and shift and change the culture, make something that was once acceptable, unacceptable. And I think we can do that. Is that hopeful for you? There you go.
I mean, apart from the bit about Liz.
Yeah.
I mean, but yeah, I mean, we could have a much happier retirement and relax if we did the work now, couldn't we? And not panic when we're 70, and then just sit back and chill, basically, in our 70s, which is the ambition. It is the plan. But I agree, you know, if we just start with boys that are born today and now and have a cut-off that no longer does this happen with the next generation of children, the harms towards girls and the harms towards boys that is done in those early years and is ingrained in people growing up. It's a real opportunity, actually, that we've got to do this. Okay, nice positive place to end.